If you grew up between the 1990s all the way to the 2010s, there is an extremely solid chance that you've played Pokemon. From the classic entries in the Game Boy generation all to whatever we have now on the Switch, Pokemon is nothing short of amazing. And most people agree the Game Boy Advance era of Pokemon was one of the best. And it all started with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, which released on March 19th, 2003 in North America, November 21st, 2002 in Japan, July 25th, 2003 in Europe, and April 3rd, 2003 in Australia. In North America, the first Pokemon games we got were Red and Blue. Now, depending on where you live, you could have gotten Red and Green, but for most of us, the series started with Red and Blue. And these games were great, but there were a lot of things that Pokemon could do to improve in the future. And they did that with Pokemon Yellow, Gold, Silver, and Crystal. But all of these games were on the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. And though both of these consoles are great, they just weren't strong enough to keep up with the times. So when Nintendo inevitably released the Game Boy Advance, it was just a matter of time before we got a new Pokemon game for the console. And with the huge jump in power from the Game Boy Color to the Game Boy Advance, the Pokemon Company was able to do so much more.
I can't. It's too beautiful.
After the release of Pokemon Crystal, the Pokemon Company began to develop Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. The goal of development was simple. They wanted to take everything that was great about the original Pokemon games and make it even better to attract returning players, but keep everything simple enough to make it so newcomers could join in easily. The first big change that came to Ruby and Sapphire was, of course, the brand new Hoenn region. Based on the Japanese island and region of Kyushu, the Hoenn region did something different and was somewhere that wasn't attached to the main Pokemon lands that we'd come to know. In Generation 1 and 2, the lands were connected, which meant in the Gen 2 games you were able to travel to both the Kanto and Johto region. But this was the first standalone new region we got in a Pokemon game. You gotta come to the Kanto region.
What do you want me to do, swim there?
Now, I'm not gonna sit here and say Hoenn has no issues, but I think this is one of my favorite regions in the entire series. The most common complaint is that, especially in the latter half of the game, there is far too much water. And I can understand that criticism, but I don't really find it to be that big of an issue. If you use enough repels, it gets rid of the annoying random encounters, but as a game design choice, I don't really love the water section of the map. It's not just the surfing that's the issue, it's having to dive and climb waterfalls, which means you need a Pokemon that knows all three of those moves for a majority of the game. But along with the new region, we also got 135 new Pokemon. The Pokemon they added to this generation are some of my favorite in the entire series. From the very first Pokemon you see with Torchic, Mudkip, and Treecko, you can tell the new Pokemon they added are going to be incredible. Of course, with new Pokemon, they also added a bunch of new moves and the addition of abilities and natures. But my favorite new thing was the inclusion of double battles. For the first time in a Pokemon game, you can now do a 2v2 Pokemon battle, which was an incredible idea and it just makes sense. I'm the type of person who prefers a double battle to a single battle. There are just so many possibilities and so many different strategies that you can employ that make them really stand out to me compared to the regular battles. And arguably just as important as double battles was the inclusion of running shoes. I can't be the only one who thinks it's hard to go back and play games like Red, Blue, and Yellow because I can't use running shoes. I've just grown so accustomed to running everywhere that it really throws me out of the loop if I'm not able to do so. Pretty much everything they've added to this game has stuck around in later Pokemon games. But even though they added all these new incredible things, they got rid of something I really liked about the older games, and that was the day and night cycle. In Gold, Silver, and Crystal, you had a day and night cycle that showed what time of day it was going to be while you're playing. If it was 10 p.m. when you were playing, it was 10 p.m. in game, and there were different things you could do at night that you couldn't do during the day. But that feature was removed from all of the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games, and I don't think I'll ever understand why. Another area where I think Ruby and Sapphire struggle to find their footing is the story. I love most of Gen 3's story, but there are some things about Ruby and Sapphire in particular that weren't perfect. Now, you start by being transported to the Hoenn region in the back of a U-Haul van, which is wild. Your parents had a blatant disregard for your safety. But once you start the game, you find out your father's the gym leader a few towns over, which is something I really love. This was the first Pokemon game that gave you a dad.
A what?
And the fact that he was a gym leader made it all the more satisfying when you eventually get to fight him. Depending on who you select, your rival's either going to be Brendan or May. And this is the point where Pokemon started getting pretty soft with the rivals. In Gen 1 and 2, you had Blue and Silver, and these were rivals that you actually wanted to beat. They were dislikable, which made it so every single time you saw them in the wild, it made you want to beat them down. But with May and Brendan, I just see them and I get kind of disappointed that they're going to take me out of the flow of the game. You had an additional rival, if you can even call him that, with Wally. He serves as your tutorial about how to catch Pokemon in the beginning of the game, but throughout your journey you get updates about how he's doing as well. And I'll be honest, I like Wally a lot more than either Brendan or May. he at least has a morsel of character development throughout the story, and getting to see him go from a wimpy little kid to someone who's somewhat confident is a nice touch. But I think the part where this game really struggled story-wise was the villain organizations. You had Team Magma and Team Aqua, and both of them are kind of strange in the grand scheme of Pokemon teams. In the first two games, you deal with Team Rocket, and they were a simple criminal organization who just mistreated Pokemon and stole them from other people. They weren't overly complicated, they were just a global crime syndicate with the goal of making a lot of money. But Team Magma and Team Aqua have entirely different ambitions. Team Magma wants to create a lot more land, and Team Aqua wants to create a lot more water. So it doesn't take a mathematician to realize there's going to be a problem here. And depending on what version you play, you see the evil team's plans come to fruition. And I think Team Magma and Team Aqua are decent enough when they're together, but separately it's hard to get behind either of their plans. Luckily, they end up fixing that in a later game, but we'll touch on that later. Just like in every other main series Pokemon game, you're collecting gym badges throughout your journey, and once you have all 8 for the region, you can fight the Elite Four. And one thing this game has in spades is a great selection of characters. All of the gym leaders are pretty solid, and the Elite Four is great as well. Now, as far as the Game Boy Advance Pokemon games go, these are my least favorite. I absolutely love the Hoenn region, but this is the worst way to play it. I would personally reach for Emerald or Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire before I go back for these games. I wouldn't even say they're close to being bad, but when there's better versions out, I'd rather play those. You're not gonna go wrong picking up these games, they're great, but they could be better. But the Pokemon Company quickly realized they had made something really great here, and they now had an incredible opportunity in front of them. And they took their older games and they remade them for new hardware, something that they are known for to this day, and it all started with FireRed and LeafGreen, which released on September 9th, 2004 in North America, January 29th, 2004 in Japan, October 1st, 2004 in Europe, and September 23rd, 2004 in Australia. It is now very commonplace for Pokemon to take their older games and put them onto modern hardware. But this was the first time Nintendo had the opportunity to even attempt this. Using a modified version of the engine from Ruby and Sapphire, the Pokemon Company and Game Freak made Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen. It was everything you loved about Pokemon Red and Blue, but this time it was in full color. And I'm really glad in this case they ended up going with Red and Green. The original versions of the Pokemon games came out as Red and Green in Japan, so to me, when we got FireRed and LeafGreen here in the States, it felt like we were getting the authentic version. The big selling point of FireRed and LeafGreen is that it came with the wireless adapter, a new fancy piece of technology that allowed two Game Boy Advance systems to wirelessly communicate with one another, which made it so you no longer had to use the link cable in order to trade. Now, the technology for the time was incredible, but compared to what we have today, it's not that impressive. It's not like you could trade with someone who was miles away. In order to actually trade, you had to be pretty close to one another, but for the time, this was a great idea. And it's what started us on the path to getting the wireless communication we now know in Pokemon games. Now, FireRed and LeafGreen are authentic remakes. Almost everything you love about the original versions remains unchanged, with some notable exceptions. Unlike the original Red and Blue, you can now choose between playing as a male or female protagonist. And I'm really glad they included that, because it would be weird if you could only play as a male character again when the option was already there in every other Pokemon game. All of the big changes that were added in other Pokemon games, like genders, natures, and abilities, are now available in FireRed and LeafGreen, which made the Pokemon battling experience more fun and balanced than it was in the original versions. There was an entire new area to the game called the Sevi Islands, which gives you a better post-game experience along with a new story, and 7 separate islands to explore that are full of great content, and they move certain Pokemon around, like moving Moltres over to the Sevi Islands. And that might sound like a lot, but you're pretty much getting the same Pokemon experience that you got in the original games. But this time it felt like a more modern experience. The game still starts in Pallet Town with you having beef with your neighbor, and Professor Oak giving you the choice between Charmander, Squirtle, and Bulbasaur. It had all of the Kanto Pokemon you'd come to know and love throughout the years, and yes, that includes the best Pokemon of all time, Bellsprout.
You also love Bellsprout, right?
The villain organization remains the same, where you're battling Team Rocket, and they were just as menacing as they always were. I'm not going to say they're the best villain organization in Pokemon, but they are far from the worst. The main charm of this game was getting to explore the Kanto region again, but this time in full color. Kanto is a region that a lot of people think is the best Pokemon has ever had. I personally don't agree, but you can tell me in the comments what you think. And while you're there, you might as well subscribe and ring the bell. But Kanto has always felt weirdly designed to me. Once you've beaten most of the game, it's very easy to get from town to town, but up until that point, you're jumping through hoops in order to get from one location to another. The excuse that the person won't let me pass because they haven't had their tea yet doesn't really sit well with me.
Can I go through? Yeah, I don't think so, buddy. I haven't had my tea yet.
What does that have to do with me?
But all of the locations you get to explore are pretty incredible. I'm a big fan of the Safari Zone, and I think Gen 1 did it the best. And getting to see the first generation of Pokemon in full color for the first time is something I don't think people talk about enough. I think another great thing about the Kanto region is that they have a perfect pool of gym leaders. All of the designs are so unique, and I think it's really great to see a lot of characters that have become staples in the Pokemon series get their start as the first gym leaders. For fans of the anime, you gotta see Brock and Misty, and for people like me, we got Blaine.
Are you my dad?
But overall, I think FireRed and LeafGreen are to this day the best way to play the Kanto region. If I wanted to get really nitpicky, I could say there are some issues. They had a great opportunity to add things from Pokemon Yellow to make this game really feel like the best version it could be. Even just having Pokemon walk behind you like in that game was something that was great. I know this was the first time Pokemon did a remake, and down the line we ended up getting spoiled with games like Heart Gold Soul Silver and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, but if they were to add just a little bit of details from Pokemon Yellow, it would be even better. I mean, they could have even added the Johto region into this game if they wanted, because it's all connected. I know that would be a huge undergoing, and it would make this a brand new game entirely, being essentially the opposite of Gold and Silver, and I think that would have made this the best version of a Pokemon game we've ever gotten. But as it stands, FireRed and LeafGreen are great as it is. Sure, these are things that could have been added in hindsight, but the Pokemon Company and Game Freak were under no obligation to add any of that in the first place. And I think their biggest crime was making it so Bellsprout was a version exclusive to Pokemon LeafGreen, which made it so it's never worth it to play FireRed at any point ever. But because Pokemon got into the itch of remaking games, they ended up doing what they do best and making a third version of the Gen 3 games with Pokemon Emerald, which released on May 1st, 2005 in North America, September 16th, 2004 in Japan, October 21st, 2005 in Europe, and June 9th, 2005 in Australia. Now, I said earlier that Ruby and Sapphire are the worst way to play the Gen 3 games, even though they're still great games. And this is part of the reason why Ruby and Sapphire don't hold up as well today, because Pokemon Emerald fixed most of the issues I had with the original Pokemon games. This wasn't the first time Pokemon had made a deluxe version of their games. Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Crystal are both deluxe versions in the same realm as this, and they did an incredible job with Pokemon Emerald just like they did with Yellow and Crystal. One of the major changes that was fixed is that in this version, both Team Aqua and Team Magma appear equally as often. It's not like in Ruby and Sapphire where one organization dominates the other. You get to see a real conflict between the two, and I think that works so much better for the story and how it flows. It just makes more sense to me the teams would be a little bit more evenly matched and competing for the same goals, where in the original versions, one team would get steamrolled by the other. They also changed a bunch of locations throughout the game to include more double battles, which I think was a brilliant idea because for the first game, it didn't really work as well as I think they wanted it to. And I think my favorite change that came to Emerald was the fact they focused more on Rayquaza than just Kyogre and Groudon. Or Rayquaza, however you want to pronounce it's fine. Getting to see Kyogre and Groudon beefing just to have Rayquaza come out of nowhere and set them straight was probably the peak of cinematics as a kid. In this version you can catch all 3 legendary Pokemon, so if you wanted to have Kyogre, Groudon, and Rayquaza, you didn't have to trade with friends in order to get it. And I don't know about you, but there was a 0% chance I was ever trading away my legendaries to friends.
Because I had none.
And overall, all the changes to the main gameplay are pretty great. Now, they didn't fix a lot of issues that people had with the Gen 3 games, mainly the over-reliance on HMs and the amount of water you'd have to navigate through, but I really can't think of anything they could have done to make it less annoying, without doing some major changes to the game itself. I guess they could have had Mr. Briny at one part of the game where they could drive you from island to island, or they could just build a giant bridge. But if you were looking for this game to have a great fix for all of the water-based sections of the game, you were going to be sorely disappointed. Now, another area where this game truly shined was the inclusion of the Battle Frontier. Really early on in the game, you meet a shady guy named Scott, and pretty much every time you do something at all eventful, he'll be there to compliment you and just plant seeds about joining the Battle Frontier. And after you beat the Elite Four, you're able to go to the Battle Frontier for the first time. And even though this is an absolute nightmare to beat through, it manages to be incredibly fun. The Battle Frontier is composed of 7 different battle facilities, each led by a Frontier Brain. In order to challenge a Frontier Brain, you have to go on a win streak in their battle facility, and I'm not exaggerating when I'm telling you that it took me years to actually beat this. But for some reason, Pokemon Emerald was the last main series Pokemon game we got on the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance didn't have a giant life cycle, releasing in 2001 where the DS released in 2004. which was a surprisingly quick turnaround for something that was an incredible console. But that meant that we only got a very small selection of Pokemon games for this console. But we did get 2 separate side games that were both pretty fun, with the first of which being Pokemon Pinball Ruby and Sapphire, which released on August 25th, 2003 in North America, August 1st, 2003 in Japan, November 14th, 2003 in Europe, and September 26th, 2003 in Australia. Whenever you think of Pokemon, I think the first thing in everybody's heads is pinball.
Nope, all that's going on up here is mega low punny.
Now, this wasn't a weird idea for the series. Pokemon has had some very strange side games throughout its years, but this is a Pokemon side game where I never hear someone asking for a new one. It's a sequel to the original Pokemon Pinball that came out for the Game Boy Color, and I can't say that either of these games are gonna win any awards, but they're what I refer to as road trip games. These were games that were meant to be endlessly replayable to keep you busy for hours on end, and what they lacked in substance, they made up for in replayability. There's not really much to say about it, beyond the fact if you don't like pinball, you'll probably hate it, but if you can tolerate pinball even a little bit, you'll probably have a great time. But the most important spin-off game was absolutely Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team, which released on September 18th, 2006 in North America, November 17th, 2005 in Japan, November 10th, 2006 in Europe, and September 28th, 2006 in Australia. Now, unlike Pokemon Pinball, this is a Pokemon game with an actual story. Don't get me wrong, I love Pokemon Pinball, but they scratch different itches. Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team released at the same time as its sister game for the DS, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team. But Red Rescue Team was the Game Boy Advance version of this game, and it is a surprisingly addicting series. It had a really deep story, and especially for the time, that was something very new to Pokemon. This came out well before Diamond and Pearl did, which meant this was the first Pokemon game to have a really deep story. Now, one of the things that makes this a really different game is the fact that you can play as Pokemon. You're no longer just a trainer who's battling Pokemon to gain badges, you are the Pokemon themselves. You start by taking a personality quiz and you end up becoming one of 16 separate Pokemon, the best of which being Psyduck, but that's only because you cannot play as Bellsprout, and trust me, I've already written my fair share of strongly worded letters. That'll show him. And it's not only different from the fact that you can play as Pokemon, it's also different because the gameplay itself is entirely new. There are a load of different Mystery Dungeon games that released in Japan, but this was the first Pokemon Mystery Dungeon game, which meant that this was the first time the series had delved into the world of roguelike gameplay. All of the dungeons are procedurally generated, meaning that you're not going to get the same experience every single time. If you faint inside the cavern that you're in, you have to restart from the beginning with an entirely new different dungeon, and you lose all of your items along the way. It has its pros and cons, but with the biggest pro being that you can play this game a bunch of different times and never really get the same experience twice. The story is going to be the same every time you play it, but gameplay wise you're in for something decently fresh every time you try. But especially with the early games in the series, it's definitely got its challenges. Fainting matters a lot more in this game than it would in something like the original main series games. And especially for people like me who came from the main series games, it's going to have a large learning curve. But if you're into any kind of roguelike or dungeon crawling game, this will be for you. And unlike every other game on this list, there are 2 solid ways to play it. If you're an NSO member, you can play the original version of Red Rescue Team in the Game Boy Advance section of the NSO offerings, which if you're on a budget, this is the best way to play it. But if you have some money to spare, you can also play Pokemon Mystery Dungeon DX, which is an enhanced remake of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red and Blue Rescue Team, which is easily the best way to experience this story. But if you're on a budget, there's a much cheaper way to do it, so it really depends on who you are. But it's unfortunate because this is the only Pokemon game that came out for the Game Boy Advance that is easily accessible by anyone. For some reason, Nintendo, the Pokemon Company, or Game Freak haven't given us the ability to play through any of the original Game Boy Advance Pokemon games easily in years. Now, there are a lot of ideas floating around about why this is the case. It could come down to something like greed, where they want to remake these games so giving us a free version of them would compete with sales, which I understand to a certain point, but there are ways they could get around that. Other people like to say it's because there were slot machines in Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen, and since gambling is something that Pokemon has tried to stay away from in recent years, I can understand why they wouldn't want to put these games out if they had that still in the game. But again, that sounds like a lazy reason to me. But until the day comes that they say verbatim that they're not going to bring these games to the Switch or Switch 2, I can have a little bit of hope in my heart that they're going to bring these games over to NSO and I won't have to cry myself to sleep anymore.
I still will cry myself to sleep tonight. but this time I don't have to.
But even though the Game Boy Advance had an extremely short life cycle, it still managed to get some incredible Pokemon games to release for the console. What do you think the best Pokemon game on the Game Boy Advance was? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.